Seoul was a neon-drenched titan, a sprawling landscape of sapphire glass and silver steel that pulsed with the frantic energy of 10 million souls, and Seo Jun-Hyuk was its undisputed architect. From the apex of the SJ Global Tower, a shimmering needle that pierced the low-hanging clouds of the Gangnam district, he stood as the master of all he surveyed. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the city below looked like a motherboard come to life, with millions of data points moving in a rhythm he had spent a decade perfecting. But at 35, with a net worth that made international headlines and a legacy built on the world's most advanced artificial intelligence, Jun-Hyuk felt a hollow ache in his chest, a silence so profound it was deafening. Every handshake was calculated, every bow saturated with hidden agendas. The tech industry in Seoul was a gladiatorial arena where billions were won and lost on single decisions, where a moment of weakness could destroy an empire. He was a billionaire in a city that worshipped success, yet he was a ghost in his own life, surrounded by expensive, silent things that couldn't breathe or love him back. His wavy, shoulder-length hair fell over his sharp features as he leaned his forehead against the cool glass, his muscular frame tense beneath a tailored silk shirt. He was the most powerful man in South Korea, his face on magazine covers, his name spoken with reverence in boardrooms. And yet, standing in his fortress of glass and steel, he had never felt more alone. On the other side of the Han River, in the vibrant, chaotic streets of Hongdae where the air smelled of spicy tteokbokki and echoed with K-pop, lived Ayo Falade. Her world was not a sterile office of glass and chrome, but a sun-drenched studio apartment overflowing with specialized hardware, humming servers, and the warm, vibrant colors of her heritage. Traditional Nigerian fabrics draped over her furniture, bringing splashes of amber and indigo to the small space. Ayo was a brilliant independent software architect, a woman who didn't just write code, she painted with it, creating interfaces that bridged the gap between cold technology and human warmth. Her long, black curls cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face dominated by deep, liquid brown eyes that held a fire Jun-Hyuk's world had long since extinguished. She was a woman of striking curves, her figure lush and soft in all the right places, carrying herself with fierce, quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was. She was in Seoul on a 2-year work visa, freelancing and building her own projects after going independent 6 months ago. She wasn't rich in the way the men in the tabloids were, but she was rich in purpose, perfectly content in her solitude until the afternoon the sky decided to break her routine and change everything. The weather in Seoul was notoriously temperamental that day, spring trying to assert itself against winter's stubborn hold. One moment the sun was catching the edges of the skyscrapers, turning the glass facades into mirrors of gold. The next, heavy clouds rolled in from the Yellow Sea, and a thick, misty rain began to coat the pavement in a slick, dark sheen that reflected the neon signs and made the whole city look like it was melting. Ayo, clutching her heavy equipment bag containing a high-end prototype VR headset she'd been working on for 3 months and a delicate external drive that held every version of her source code, the culmination of a year's worth of work, ducked under the deep emerald awning of an upscale coffee shop in Sinsadong. She'd been meeting with a potential client, a meeting that had gone nowhere, another company that wanted her skills but balked at her rates, and she was frustrated, tired, ready to get home to her small apartment and lose herself in code for the rest of the evening. She was so focused on shielding her hardware from the moisture, rearranging the bag to keep water from seeping through the zipper, that she didn't see the glass door fly open with a violent, frustrated shove. Seo Jun-Hyuk stepped out, his face a dark mask of irritation after a board meeting where his elders, the old guard investors who still held too much power, had once again tried to stifle his vision for the next generation of Neuralinks, calling it too risky, too ambitious, too expensive. They wanted incremental improvements to existing products. He wanted to change the world. The conflict was exhausting, endless, maddening. He didn't see her. His mind was still in the boardroom, replaying arguments, calculating his next move. He walked right into her with the full force of his frustration behind him. The impact wasn't violent, but it was enough to send Ayo's bag slipping from her grasp, the strap breaking under the sudden stress. The equipment spilled onto the wet, gleaming sidewalk in what felt like slow motion, each piece hitting the concrete with sickening thuds. The external drive skidded toward a storm drain, spinning like a hockey puck on ice, and the VR headset tumbled over the concrete, one of the delicate sensors cracking audibly against the rough surface. "Oh, God, no!" Ayo gasped, her voice a rich, melodic contrast to the rhythmic drumming of the rain, panic rising in her chest as she watched 3 months of work sliding towards Seoul's efficient drainage system. She dropped to her knees instantly, ignoring the cold water soaking through her jeans, her hands flying to rescue the drive just inches from the churning water of the gutter, her fingers closing around it just as it teetered on the edge. Relief flooded through her, immediately replaced by dread as she turned to assess the damage to the headset. Jun-Hyuk froze, his polished Oxford shoes planted in a puddle he normally would have avoided. His temper, usually a live wire that sparked at the slightest provocation after meetings like the one he'd just endured, was instantly grounded by the sight of her. He'd been preparing to snap, to deliver some cutting remark about watching where she was going, his default response to any inconvenience in his carefully controlled world. He expected a frantic apology calculated to turn into an opportunity, a scream of recognition followed by aggressive selfie requests, or the inevitable fawning that followed him everywhere, the wide eyes and breathy "Aren't you Seo Jun-Hyuk?" that he heard a dozen times a day. Instead, he saw a woman whose only concern was her work, a woman who didn't even glance at him, who was frantically checking equipment he didn't recognize, muttering under her breath in English tinged with an accent he couldn't place. He watched her long, curly hair dampen in the mist, the water causing it to spring and curl even more wildly around her face. A stray drop of rain traced the line of her throat, disappearing beneath the collar of her shirt, and he found himself tracking its path with an intensity that shocked him. He felt a sudden, violent jolt in his chest, a physical reaction that had nothing to do with the collision and everything to do with the woman kneeling on the wet pavement before him. It was a magnetic pull, a primal recognition, like his body knew something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice a low, startled rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air between them, rougher than he intended, threaded with an emotion he couldn't name. Ayo didn't look up yet, her fingers snatching the drive from the edge of the drain, then moving to the headset, carefully examining the cracked sensor with the focused intensity of someone assessing damage to something irreplaceable. "My source code," she whispered, more to herself than him, relief in her voice. "Everything is on this." Then, turning to the headset, her shoulders sagging, and 3 months of hardware development just got a crack in the primary motion sensor. Without thinking, without calculating the cost to his Loro Piana coat or considering who might be watching, the billionaire who had just walked out on a $1 trillion deal, who employed 1,500 people and whose decisions moved markets, knelt in the dirty rainwater beside her. His expensive wool coat immediately soaked up the gray slush of the sidewalk, the moisture seeping through to his knees, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, he didn't care about the optics, about maintaining his image, about anything except helping this woman whose panic he could feel radiating off her in waves. He reached for the VR headset with surprising gentleness for such large hands, his callous fingers, hands that usually sign the fates of industries with fountain pens that cost thousands of dollars, carefully brushing the moisture from the device as if it were made of spun glass. He could see the crack she was talking about, a hairline fracture across what looked like a high-end sensor module. "Is it fixable?" he asked, genuinely curious, his tech background making him appreciate the craftsmanship of the device. As he handed it back to her, their fingers brushed, skin against skin in the cold rain. The touch was electric, more than static, more than the simple contact of two people. It was a current that traveled through Ayo's arm and settled deep in her core, sudden and undeniable, making her breath catch in her throat. She finally looked up, her brown eyes meeting his dark, intense gaze, and the world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. She saw a man who was breathtakingly handsome in a way that felt almost dangerous. Wavy hair that brushed his shoulders, slightly disheveled from the wind and rain, framing a face that could have been carved from stone. Sharp jawline, full lips that looked like they rarely smiled, high cheekbones, and eyes that held storms behind them. There was a strength in his posture that felt like a mountain, immovable and powerful, his broad shoulders and muscular frame evident even beneath the expensive coat. But she also saw the weariness there, the hidden lines of a man who carried the world on his back, a bone-deep exhaustion that wealth and power couldn't erase. She didn't know who he was. She wasn't plugged into Korean business news, didn't follow tech industry gossip, spent her time in code repositories and developer forums, not reading Forbes Korea or watching business channels. To her, he was just a man with a heavy soul and an intensity that made her skin feel warm despite the cold rain. And so, Ayo Falade did the one thing no one ever did to the CEO of SJ Global. She laughed. It was a warm, bubbling sound that cut through the gray afternoon like a ray of light, like sunshine breaking through clouds. It was genuine, unforced, the kind of laughter that came from relief and absurdity and the sudden, unexpected kindness of a stranger kneeling in the rain to help her save her work. "It's just hardware," she said, wiping a smudge of rain from her cheek with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt she didn't notice. "Fixable, eventually. And honestly, I think Seoul's sidewalks could use a bit of high-tech decoration. It's better than more ads for plastic surgery clinics." She gestured at the bus stop behind them, plastered with before and after photos. Jun-Hyuk was captivated, completely and utterly knocked off balance in a way that hadn't happened since he was a teenager. The way she spoke, confident and warm with that accent he was desperate to place. The confidence in her curves, the way she didn't seem remotely intimidated or impressed by him, the heat in her eyes that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with passion for her work. It was intoxicating, like breathing pure oxygen after years in a stuffy room. He wanted to keep her talking, to hear that laugh again, to understand who this woman was who could make kneeling in a puddle feel like the most important thing he'd done all day. "Please," he said, his voice dropping an octave without him intending it to, taking on a rough quality that made Ayo's pulse quicken. "Let me buy you a coffee." "Not from here." He gestured dismissively at the upscale café behind them. "This place is too loud and the beans are burnt. I know a spot 3 blocks away. They use real ceramic mugs and the silence is expensive and peaceful. You can check your equipment properly, dry off." Ayo studied him, really looked at him for the first time, taking in the details her panic had made her miss. The custom-tailored suit beneath the ruined coat. The watch on his wrist that probably cost more than her entire year's rent. The way he held himself with unconscious authority, like someone used to rooms falling silent when he entered. He was clearly wealthy, probably someone important in the business world she actively avoided. But there was a raw honesty in his request that surprised her, a vulnerability in his eyes that didn't match the power in his posture. And there was something else, a heat in the way he looked at her that made her very aware of her wet clothes clinging to her curves, of the space between them that suddenly felt both too close and not close enough. "All right," she said, a playful smile playing on her lips despite her better judgment. "But only if you promise not to talk about your stock portfolio or try to recruit me for your company. I've had enough of men in suits trying to lowball my rates for one day." "Deal," he said immediately, standing and offering her his hand. When she took it, he pulled her to her feet with effortless strength, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and subtle, mixing with the scent of rain. "No business talk. Just coffee. And maybe you can tell me what you were building." That headset looked custom. They walked together through the drizzling rain, his large umbrella shielding them both, their shoulders brushing occasionally in the confined space beneath it. Every time they touched, the tension between them ratcheted tighter, like a wire being wound until it hummed with strain. Ayo found herself acutely aware of him beside her, the heat of his body, the way his long legs adjusted his pace to match her shorter stride, the subtle flex of his arm as he held the umbrella. Jun-Hyuk was having his own revelation, noticing things he normally missed. The way she walked with unconscious grace despite carrying heavy equipment. the curve of her hip when she shifted the bag to her other shoulder, the way her curls caught drops of rain that escaped the umbrella's protection, the water making them gleam. The sound of her voice as she talked about the neighborhood, pointing out a street art piece she loved, a shop that sold the best kimchi jjigae, her enthusiasm for the city infectious and genuine. They ended up in a small, hidden cafe tucked away in an alley she never would have found on her own, a place that smelled of roasted cinnamon and old parchment, with warm wood paneling and soft lighting that felt like stepping into someone's private library. The owner, an elderly man with kind eyes, greeted Jun-Hyuk with familiarity but discretion, leading them to a corner booth that was partially hidden from the rest of the cafe by a bookshelf. The table was small, intimate, forcing their knees to touch underneath it, a point of contact neither of them moved to break. They talked for hours, the coffee cooling forgotten as the conversation flowed. Jun-Hyuk didn't mention his billions or his company or the fact that his face was currently on the cover of 3 different business magazines. Instead, he found himself telling her about his secret love for old-school mechanical watches, pulling back his sleeve to show her a vintage Patek Philippe that had belonged to his grandfather, the only thing he owned that he truly treasured because of its history rather than its value. He told her about his childhood dream of building a city that ran on kindness instead of competition, a dream that seemed increasingly naive the deeper he got into the tech world's cutthroat realities. Everyone talks about innovation, he said, turning his coffee cup in his hands, but what they really mean is profit. I wanted to build AI that would help people, really help them. Instead, I've built AI that helps companies extract more money from people. It's effective. It's profitable. He paused, searching for the word soulless. Ayo reached across the table, her hand covering his, a gesture of comfort that felt entirely natural despite them being strangers. The touch sent electricity through both of them. Maybe you're building the foundation, she said softly. The infrastructure has to exist before the dream can. You can't have a kind city without roads, right? Maybe you're just laying the roads, and someone else will build the kindness on top. Or maybe, she squeezed his hand, you'll do that part next. He turned his palm up, threading his fingers through hers, marveling at how perfectly they fit together, the contrast of their skin tones, the warmth of her hand in his. They sat like that for a long moment, just looking at each other, the cafe fading into the background until it felt like they were the only 2 people in the world. Ayo told him about her family back home in Lagos, about her mother who sold fabric in the market and her father who was a schoolteacher, both of whom had scraped together everything they had to send her to university. About how her mother's laughter sounded like music, filling their small house with joy even when money was tight. About how it felt to see a line of code finally manifest into a beautiful, functional interface, that moment of creation when something that existed only in her mind suddenly became real and tangible. My mother thinks I'm crazy, Ayo said with a laugh. She doesn't understand what I do. She tells people I work with computers and leaves it at that. But she's proud anyway. She keeps newspaper clippings about technology, even though she doesn't understand them, just in case I'm mentioned. I'm not, obviously, but she keeps them anyway. She sounds wonderful, Jun-Hyuk said, trying to imagine having a mother who clipped newspapers out of pride rather than obligation to maintain appearances. His own mother barely acknowledged his existence unless it was to introduce him to the daughter of some business associate, another calculated connection in the endless networking of Seoul's elite. She is, Ayo said softly. She taught me that you can't let the world make you small. That taking up space is not something to apologize for. For the first time in his life, Jun-Hyuk wasn't a commodity, wasn't being assessed for his usefulness or his connections or his bank account. He was just a man, sitting in a cafe, talking to a fascinating woman who had no idea she was talking to one of the most powerful people in South Korea. And Ayo, who saw the fire behind his cold exterior, who recognized the loneliness in him because she sometimes felt it herself, was utterly charmed, drawn to him in a way that felt both exciting and slightly dangerous, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of the drop. But as the rain stopped and the evening lights began to twinkle across the Han River, visible through the cafe's small window, The reality of his life came crashing back with brutal force. He saw a black sedan idling at the end of the alley through the window, recognized it as one of his security team's vehicles. They must have tracked his phone, followed at a discreet distance, watching to make sure their charge was safe. He knew that inside that car, someone was probably taking photos, logging this meeting, preparing a report. He knew the tabloids would pay 6 figures for a clear photo of him with an unknown woman, that the speculation would be immediate and vicious. The weight of his world, briefly forgotten in her presence, came crashing back down on his shoulders. He saw the future stretch out before him with sickening clarity. If he pursued this, if he let himself have what he wanted for once in his carefully controlled life, Ayo would be devoured by his world. The press would dig into her background, would find out everything about her family, her visa status, her finances. His competitors would see her as leverage, a weakness to exploit. His own board of directors would view her as a distraction, a liability. They would tear her life apart just to see if it would make him stumble, make him vulnerable, give them an opening to seize more control of his company. Ayo, he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper, rough with emotion and fear. He took her hand again, needing the contact, his palm warm and rough against her softer skin. What happened today? It was the first time I felt alive in years. The first time I felt like a person instead of a commodity. Ayo's heart hammered against her ribs, sensing the shift in his energy, the tension that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with dread. I feel it too, she admitted. Whatever this is. But my life is a minefield, Jun-Hyuk continued, his grip tightening almost painfully, his eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. There are people, competitors, journalists, even my own family, who would use you to get to me. They would tear your life apart just to see me stumble. The tech industry here, it's not like other places. It's war, constant and brutal, and anyone close to me becomes a target. If you're feeling the intensity of what's building between Ayo and Jun-Hyuk, hit that subscribe button now because you won't believe where this forbidden romance is headed. The stakes are about to get so much higher. Ayo felt ice forming in her stomach, even as her hand remained warm in his. The intensity in his eyes was terrifying and beautiful all at once, a man clearly wrestling with something huge. I want to see you again, Jun-Hyuk continued, his voice cracking slightly with the force of his emotion. More than I've ever wanted anything. More than my next product launch, more than winning against my competitors, more than any of it. But no one can know. It has to be our secret. Just for a while, just until I can shore up my defenses, until I can make the people who would hurt you understand that the cost would be too high. I need time to protect you properly. Ayo felt a flicker of doubt, sharp and cold. A secret? It felt like a regression, like every story she'd heard about powerful men who kept women hidden away in convenient corners of their lives. It felt like being diminished, made smaller, hidden. Her mother's words echoed in her head. Taking up space is not something to apologize for. But then she looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the sheer terror in his eyes. This wasn't a man casually suggesting an affair. This was a man genuinely afraid, not of being found out, but of what would happen to her if they were. He wasn't trying to hide her because he was ashamed. He was trying to protect her because he was terrified of losing the only real thing he'd found in a decade of hollow success. How long, she asked, needing to understand the scope of what he was asking. I don't know, he admitted, and she respected the honesty even as it made her heart sink. Months, maybe. Until I can consolidate my position, until I can make it clear that anyone who touches you answers to me. Until I can make you untouchable. Ayo was quiet for a long moment, weighing her independence against the connection she felt to this complicated, broken, intense man. Okay, Jun-Hyuk, she whispered finally. Our secret. But not forever. I need you to promise me this is temporary, that eventually I get to exist in your daylight. I promise, he said fervently, pulling her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles with a reverence that made her breath catch. Not forever. Just until it's safe. Just until I can make sure loving me doesn't destroy you. And so, their hidden life began. Jun-Hyuk's private driver would pick her up in an unmarked car 3 blocks from her apartment, the meeting point changing each time to avoid patterns, to avoid detection. He would bring her to his penthouse in Seoul, to the fortress he'd built at the top of the city. Their world existed within his four walls, a high-tech sanctuary of luxury that Ayo slowly began to turn into a home. She brought small things gradually, carefully. A blanket from her apartment in Nigerian print fabric. Photos of her family that ended up on his stark, white bookshelves. Spices for cooking that filled his sterile kitchen with warmth and life. They would cook together, an activity he'd never experienced in his adult life, his meals typically prepared by his housekeeper or ordered from expensive restaurants. The scent of Ayo's jollof rice mingling with the sharp aroma of kimchi became his favorite smell in the world, better than any expensive cologne or freshly printed money. They would sit on his massive velvet sofa, his muscular arm draped around her shoulders, her curly hair resting against his chest as they debated the ethics of AI, argued about the future of technology, discussed books and movies and the million small things that make up a life. But it was more than just conversation, more than just companionship. The sexual chemistry between them was a living, breathing force that grew stronger every time they were together. Every touch was lingering, loaded with unspoken hunger. Every gaze was heavy with desire that built and built until it became almost unbearable. The tension would coil tighter and tighter throughout the evening until one of them would break, unable to resist any longer. One night, as they stood on his balcony overlooking the neon sea of Seoul, the city spreading beneath them in a carpet of lights that looked like stars fallen to earth, Jun-Hyuk turned her to face him. The wind caught his wavy hair, making it dance around his face, and his eyes were dark with a desire that made Ayo's breath hitch in her throat, made her pulse pound in her ears. "You have no idea what you do to me," he murmured, his voice rough and low, his hands sliding down to rest on her hips, pulling her curvy frame flush against him with barely restrained force. The heat radiating from his body was staggering, making her feel like she might combust from the inside out. She could feel every hard plane of him against her softer curves, could feel the evidence of his desire, could feel the trembling control he was maintaining. "Every moment you're here, all I can think about is touching you, tasting you, making you mine in every way possible." Ayo reached up, her fingers tangling in his shoulder-length hair, pulling him down until their lips were a mere breath apart, until she could feel his breath on her face, could see the way his pupils dilated until his eyes were almost black. "Then stop thinking," she whispered against his lips, "and do it." When he finally kissed her, it was like a collision of two stars, violent and beautiful and inevitable. It was a claiming, a desperate, hungry exchange that tasted of everything they were forced to hide, everything they couldn't say in the daylight. His hands were everywhere, tracing the curves of her body with a reverence that made her feel like a goddess, like something precious and desperately desired. His touch was firm, possessive, speaking of ownership and need and a hunger that had been building for weeks. Ayo pulled him closer, her body responding to his with a primal urgency that surprised her with its intensity. She'd been with men before, but nothing like this. Nothing that felt like being consumed and cherished simultaneously. Her hands slid under his shirt, finding the hard muscle underneath, the warm skin, the rapid beat of his heart that matched her own. She wanted to memorize every inch of him, wanted to drown in him. They moved to his bedroom, a space of silk and shadows, floor-to-ceiling windows that made it feel like they were floating in the Seoul sky. The only light was the glow of the city below, neon and streetlights painting their skin in shades of blue and gold. In the darkness, they explored the landscape of each other's souls through the language of their bodies. Jun-Hyuk worshipped her, taking his time despite the urgency thrumming through both of them. His lips traced paths across her skin, learning what made her gasp, what made her arch, what made her say his name like a prayer. His hands mapped every curve, every soft place, with a thorough attention that made her feel truly seen for the first time in her life. "You're perfect," he breathed against her skin, and she believed him because of the way he touched her, like she was something miraculous. Ayo gave him the one thing he couldn't buy, couldn't take, couldn't demand. She gave him a love that was raw, honest, and entirely his. She gave him vulnerability, acceptance, passion without calculation. When they finally came together, it was with a desperation that spoke of all the time they spent apart, all the moments they couldn't touch in public, all the words they couldn't say. It was intense and overwhelming and absolutely perfect. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in his massive bed, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her back, both of them breathing hard, both of them fundamentally changed by what had just happened between them. "I love you," Jun-Hyuk said into the darkness, the words escaping before he could stop them, before he could calculate whether it was too soon, whether it was strategic. "God, Ayo, I love you so much it terrifies me." Ayo lifted her head, looking at him in the dim light, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that she might not say it back. "I love you too," she whispered, and kissed him softly. Terrifyingly, impossibly, completely. The secret world they built was perfect, but like all things built in the dark, it was fragile. The first crack appeared on a crisp autumn evening when the leaves in Seoul's parks were turning gold and red. Ayo was meeting her colleague, Jiwoo, for dinner at a Samgyeopsal restaurant in Itaewon. Jiwoo was one of the first friends she'd made in Seoul, another woman in tech who understood the challenges of being female in a male-dominated industry. Jiwoo was beaming as Ayo slid into the booth, her face radiant with a joy that was almost blinding. She held up her left hand before Ayo could even say hello, showing off a modest but beautiful diamond ring that caught the light. He proposed at the Namsan Tower. Jiwoo squealed, bouncing in her seat like a teenager instead of a 30-year-old senior developer. "Can you believe it? We're starting the planning tomorrow. I want you to be my maid of honor, Ayo. You have to say yes. You're my person." Ayo smiled, genuinely happy for her friend. She cheered, asked to see the ring up close, hugged Jiwoo across the table with real enthusiasm. But inside, a cold, heavy weight was settling in her stomach, spreading through her chest like ice water in her veins. She had a love that was 100 times more intense than what she saw in her friend's eyes. She had a man who worshipped the ground she walked on, who made her body sing and her heart soar, who looked at her like she hung the moon. Yet she couldn't even say his name. She couldn't show a picture. She couldn't share her joy with the people she cared about. She certainly couldn't plan a future that involved the light of day, couldn't imagine standing in a wedding dress, couldn't picture introducing him to her parents. Her love was a ghost, a beautiful, haunting secret that was starting to feel less like protection and more like a cage. She was living half a life, public Ayo who was single and focused on her career, and secret Ayo who was desperately in love with a man she couldn't claim. "Ayo?" Jiwoo's voice brought her back. "Are you okay? You seem distracted." "I'm fine," Ayo lied with a smile. "Just thinking about how beautiful the wedding will be. Tell me everything. What's the color scheme?" But the feeling stayed with her, growing heavier as dinner progressed, as Jiwoo talked excitedly about venues and dress shopping and the guest list. By the time they parted ways, Ayo felt like she was drowning. That night, when she arrived at the penthouse, Jun-Hyuk could feel the distance in her immediately. He tried to pull her into his arms, his lips seeking the crook of her neck where he loved to breathe in her scent, but she pulled away, needing space, needing to think. "What is it, my queen?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. He'd started calling her that weeks ago his queen, his secret royalty. "Jiwoo got engaged today," Ayo said, her voice small, staring out at the Seoul skyline instead of at him. Everyone was so happy for her. They were talking about the wedding, about where they would live, about the children they'd have. And I realized, she turned to face him, and he could see tears threatening in her eyes. "I don't exist in your life, Jun-Hyuk. I'm a ghost in a high-tech castle. I'm your hidden mistress, and I love you too much to be a secret anymore." Jun-Hyuk flinched as if she'd struck him, the words hitting like physical blows. "It's for your safety, Ayo. You don't know the people in my world. My rivals would destroy you just to get a piece of my company's data. My family would cast you as a distraction or worse, as someone trying to steal my money. The board would use you against me. I am protecting you. Are you?" Ayo's voice rose, her brown eyes flashing with a fierce light he'd never seen before, pain and anger and love all mixed together. Or are you protecting your comfortable, uncomplicated image? You get to have the power and the glory during the day, the billionaire bachelor that everyone wants. And then you come home to your secret prize at night. You get everything, Jun-Hyuk. Everything. And what do I get? I get 4 walls and a man who loves me only in the dark. That's not fair, he said, his voice strained, but she could see in his eyes that her words had landed, that some part of him knew she was right. Isn't it? She moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, close enough to touch, but she didn't. I want to hold your hand in the street. I want to tell my father back in Lagos that I've found a man who is worthy of me. I need to be seen, Jun-Hyuk. I love myself enough to know I deserve more than the shadows. The argument was devastating. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, cutting through all the careful justifications he'd built, exposing the truth underneath. They were speaking 2 different languages, one of fear and one of truth, and neither could make the other understand. Ayo looked at the man she loved, at the muscular frame and the wavy hair she had spent hours stroking while he slept, at the face she saw every time she closed her eyes, and realized that his fear was a wall she couldn't break through. No matter how much he loved her, and she knew he did, he loved his fortress more. He loved his safety more. He loved not having to choose between her and his carefully constructed world. I can't do this anymore, she whispered, and each word felt like tearing out a piece of her heart. I'm going back to my apartment. Don't send the car. I'll take the subway. Ayo, please, he reached for her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. If you ever decide that I'm worth more than this, that we're worth more than this, you know where to find me. But I'm done hiding, Jun-Hyuk. I'm done pretending that 4 walls and incredible sex and whispered I love yous are enough. Because they're not. I deserve daylight, and until you're brave enough to stand in it with me, we're done. She walked out, the click of the heavy door sounding like a gunshot in the silent penthouse. Jun-Hyuk stood alone, surrounded by the traces of her presence that somehow made the space feel emptier than it ever had before. Her favorite mug on the counter with tea leaves still floating in cold water. A stray hair tie on the table. Her Nigerian print blanket draped over the sofa. The lingering scent of her perfume in the air. And in his bedroom, where they'd made love hours before, the sheets still held the imprint of her body, still carried her warmth. For the first time in his life, his billions felt like a burden instead of an achievement. His power felt like a prison instead of freedom. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but all he had succeeded in doing was locking himself in alone, with nothing but expensive things that couldn't love him back. The days that followed were a gray blur for Jun-Hyuk. He tried to focus on work, throwing himself into the launch of his new AI interface. The project Ayo had inspired him to make more human-focused, more ethical. But the code felt empty. He would find himself staring at screens, seeing nothing, his mind constantly replaying their last conversation, her words echoing in his head. I deserve daylight. He saw her face in every screen, heard her laughter in every silent moment. His penthouse felt like a tomb, every trace of her presence a reminder of what he'd lost. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. In meetings, he would drift, his mind elsewhere, until his COO started looking at him with concern. One night, standing in his empty penthouse at 3 a.m, staring out at Seoul glittering below him, he realized something with painful clarity. She was right. She was absolutely right about all of it. He had been a coward. He had been so afraid of the world's judgment, of the complications of the risks, that he had sacrificed his own happiness and hers. He had hidden the best thing that ever happened to him because he was too afraid to fight for it. True strength wasn't about control, wasn't about maintaining a perfect image, wasn't about hiding vulnerabilities. True strength was about the courage to be vulnerable, to stand up and say, this person matters to me, and damn the consequences. True strength was what Ayo had shown when she walked away, choosing her dignity over a love that diminished her. He loved her. God, he loved her more than he'd ever loved anything. More than his company, more than his reputation, more than the carefully constructed empire he'd built. And if there was even the smallest chance of getting her back, he had to take it. But more than that, he had to do it right. He had to show her that she was worth fighting for, worth standing in the light for, worth everything. Across the city, Ayo was struggling in her own way. She threw herself into her work, but her creativity had vanished. She was a software architect who had lost her spark. She would sit in front of her screens, her hands poised over the keyboard, and nothing would come. The code that used to flow from her fingers now felt forced, mechanical, lifeless. She was a software architect who had lost her spark, yes, but more than that, she was a woman who had lost part of herself. She missed him with a physical ache that made it hard to breathe, a constant pain in her chest that never faded. She missed his voice, his touch, the way he looked at her like she was the answer to every question. She missed waking up in his arms, missed the quiet intimacy of breakfast together, missed everything. Her father called from Nigeria one evening, his timing perfect in the way parents' timing sometimes is, sensing something wrong even from thousands of miles away. "Ayo, my daughter," he said softly after the usual pleasantries, his voice warm and concerned. "You sound sad. What is troubling your heart?" She couldn't tell him everything, couldn't explain the full situation. But she found herself saying, "Baba, have you ever loved someone who wasn't brave enough to love you back?" There was a long pause. Then her father said, "A star doesn't belong in a box, Seo. It belongs in the sky where everyone can see it. If a man cannot stand in your light, if he cannot let you shine the way you were meant to, then he does not deserve your warmth. You are too bright to be hidden." Those words settled into her heart, confirming what she already knew. She had made the right choice, even if it hurt, even if it felt like dying. She had honored herself, and that had to be enough. But she didn't know that Jun-Hyuk was about to make a choice of his own, that he was about to do something so public, so dramatic, so completely out of character that it would change both of their lives forever. The annual Seoul Global Tech Summit was the biggest event of the year in Korea's tech industry. Every major player was there, every startup hoping to make connections, every investor looking for the next big thing. Along with hundreds of journalists and photographers, bloggers and influencers, all trying to capture the next viral moment. It was held at the massive COEX Convention Center, and this year's keynote speaker was none other than Seo Jun-Hyuk, set to unveil the future direction of SJ Global. Ayo attended the summit, not as his guest, but as an independent developer, networking, trying to find clients, trying to rebuild her business and her life. She wore a stunning, body-hugging dress of deep burnt orange that accentuated every curve, the color vibrant against her brown skin, making her stand out in a sea of conservative business attire. Her curly hair was a wild, beautiful halo around her face, refusing to be tamed, refusing to be subtle. She looked like fire personified, drawing eyes everywhere she went. She stood near the back of the massive auditorium, her heart heavy as Jun-Hyuk took the stage to thunderous applause. He looked magnificent, powerful and intense and heartbreakingly familiar. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, his wavy hair pulled back, his presence commanding the room with effortless authority. Just seeing him made her chest ache. He began his speech, his voice amplified through the state-of-the-art sound system, talking about data and connectivity, about the future of AI, about SJ Global's new initiatives. The audience was rapt, hanging on every word. This was the speech everyone had been waiting for, the unveiling that had been hyped for months. But then he stopped mid-sentence. Just stopped, his eyes scanning the massive crowd, searching. The silence stretched, uncomfortable, confused. People began to murmur, wondering if there was a technical problem. His eyes found her, locked onto her with an intensity that made her breath stop. A hush fell over the room, hundreds of people sensing something was happening, something unscripted. For years, Jun-Hyuk said, his voice amplified and steady but threaded with emotion, I believed that technology was the key to connection. I believed that if I built the right systems, the right algorithms, the right interfaces, I could bridge the gap between people. I believed that innovation was about hardware and software, about processing power and elegant code. The crowd was silent, confused but captivated. But I was wrong. He walked away from the podium, away from his prepared speech scrolling on the teleprompter. The only thing that truly connects us is the courage to be seen. To love openly, without fear of what the world might say. To stand up and say, this person matters to me, and mean it with everything you have, consequences be damned. The murmur grew louder. This definitely wasn't the script. Cameras were turning, trying to figure out what was happening. There is a woman in this room, he continued, his gaze still locked on Ayo, his voice strong and clear. A woman who taught me that a life lived in the shadows is no life at all. She is a brilliant software architect, building things that will change how humans interact with technology. She is a fierce spirit who knows her worth and refuses to be diminished. And she is the love of my life. The murmur became an uproar. Gasps. Shocked whispers. The click of hundreds of cameras. And for too long, Jun-Hyuk's voice rose above the noise. I have asked her to be a secret because I was afraid. Afraid of judgment, afraid of complications, afraid of showing vulnerability. I was a coward who hid the best thing that ever happened to me because I couldn't stand the thought of the world seeing me as anything other than perfectly in control. He walked off the stage, right into the middle of the crowd. Security moved to intercept him, confused, but he waved them off. The cameras flashed like lightning, the reporters scrambled, phones were everywhere, live streaming to millions. But he didn't see any of them. He only saw Ayo. He reached her, and the crowd parted like water, everyone wanting to see, to witness this moment. And there, in front of the entire Korean tech industry, in front of hundreds of cameras broadcasting live around the world, Seo Jun-Hyuk went down on one knee. The auditorium erupted in shocked gasps and excited whispers. Ayo Falade, he said, his voice thick with emotion but still clear, still strong. He pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside wasn't a traditional diamond, but a ring of intricately woven rose gold and black titanium, designed to look like the very first line of code they had debated in that cafe months ago, when everything had been simple. I don't want to protect you by hiding you anymore. I want to protect you by standing beside you, in front of you, with you. I want the whole world to know that I am yours, and if you'll have me, you're mine. Tears were streaming down Ayo's face, her hands covering her mouth, unable to speak. I was wrong, Jun-Hyuk continued. Wrong to ask you to hide. Wrong to let my fear be bigger than my love. Wrong to think that my comfort was more important than your dignity. You deserve daylight, Ayo. You deserve to be seen and celebrated and loved openly. And I am done being afraid of what that might cost me, because losing you costs infinitely more. He opened the box fully, the ring catching the lights. Will you marry me? Will you stand with me in the light of day and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you were worth every risk, every consequence, every judgment? Will you let me love you the way you deserve to be loved, proudly and publicly and with everything I have? The auditorium was silent, thousands of people holding their breath. Ayo looked at him, this billionaire who had finally become brave, who was on his knees in front of the world, offering her everything. She saw the truth in his eyes, saw the transformation, saw that he finally understood. He had torn down the fortress. He had chosen her, publicly, irrevocably. Yes, she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Then louder, for the microphones, for him, for the world. Yes, Jun-Hyuk. 1,000 times yes. The auditorium erupted like a volcano. It was chaos, it was celebration, it was the most public declaration of love Seoul's tech industry had ever seen. Jun-Hyuk stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as cameras flashed like stars, as the crowd cheered and applauded and live-streamed the moment to millions around the world. Their kiss was not a secret shared in the dark. It was a promise sealed in front of everyone, a promise of a new beginning. It was a kiss that held their past, their painful separation, and every single one of their tomorrows. His hands cupped her face, her arms wrapped around his neck, and they kissed like they were the only two people in the world, even though thousands were watching. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, both crying, he pressed his forehead to hers. I love you, he said in Korean, then in English. Sarangi. I will never hide you again. Never. I love you too, she breathed back, her fingers threading through his hair. Always. In every language. in every light. As the crowd pressed closer, offering congratulations, as reporters shouted questions, as the moment went viral across every social media platform, Ayo and Jun-Hyuk stood together. No longer a tycoon and his secret. No longer hiding. They were partners, equals, standing in the daylight where their love was always meant to be. If you were moved by Ayo and Jun-Hyuk's journey from the shadows into the light, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more epic romances that will make your heart race. Leave a comment below with your favorite part of the story. Was it their first meeting in the rain? The devastating breakup? Or that public proposal that broke the internet? Make sure to like this video and share it with everyone who believes that love is worth the risk, that real love deserves to be seen. Your support helps us bring more of these stories to life. Stories about people who dare to love boldly, who refuse to settle for less than they deserve. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we drop the next incredible romance. Let's build this community of love and passion together, celebrating stories that remind us that the best things in life are worth fighting for.